Hello family, we love having you here as always. Before we get started with this intriguing story, we would love for you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you would get notified immediately we drop new stories. As we are dedicated to you, our family, we have pledged to keep bringing you new stories daily. Now enjoy. The night was colder than usual, and the wind carried the distant sound of laughter from a nearby compound. Amaka shivered as she scrubbed the last plate in the backyard. Her fingers were numb from the cold water, but she knew better than to stop. If she finished her chores late, Madame Ephema would remind her why stopping wasn't an option. She was used to this life, waking up before the sun and working till her body ached. It had been that way since she was brought to this house 3 years ago. She had been only 12 then, confused and afraid, but she learned quickly. Tears didn't change anything, and nobody was coming to save her. Amaka, are you deaf? A voice snapped from the doorway. It was Ephema's daughter, Chinaza, standing with her hands on her hips. Mama said you should go and lock the gate. You want thieves to enter and kill all of us. Amaka didn't argue. She rinsed her hands and hurried toward the front yard, making sure to keep her head down as she passed the living room window. She locked the gate and sighed, staring up at the sky. The stars looked free. She wished she could be one of them, floating far away from this place. Before she could turn back, she heard something. A groan. Faint but distinct. She froze, listening. It was coming from outside the gate. Slowly, she stepped closer and peered through a small gap. A man was lying on the ground, barely moving. Her heart pounded. He didn't look like a troublemaker. His clothes were neat but slightly torn, his face covered in sweat. Something was wrong with him. For a moment, she hesitated. Madame Ephema would skin her alive if she opened the gate for a stranger. But could she just walk away? Could she pretend she hadn't seen him? She bit her lip, glancing back at the house. Everyone was inside, probably watching TV. If she was quick, maybe no one would notice. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the gate and stepped out. The man's breathing was shallow, his lips dry. "Sir," she whispered. He didn't respond. She touched his arm gently. He flinched but didn't open his eyes. Panic settled in her chest. What if he died here? What if she was the only one who could help him? Amaka wasn't sure what she was doing, but she knew one thing: she couldn't leave him here like this. She had to do something. Fast. Chinaza sat on the cold kitchen floor, her fingers trembling as she scrubbed the burnt bottom of a large pot. The harsh voice of Madame Ephema rang in her ears, but she had learned to block it out. The woman would always find something to complain about: either the floors weren't shining enough, or the food wasn't seasoned the way she liked. Tonight, it was the soup. Too salty, she had said, before dumping the entire pot into the sink, wasting all of Chinaza's hard work. She wanted to cry, but she had cried too many times. Now, she just worked. If she finished quickly, she could steal a moment to rest before Madame Ephema's children called her again. They were not much younger than her, but they treated her like she was nothing. She closed her eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. She thought of her mother back in the village, struggling to take care of Chinaza's younger siblings. This was why she endured everything, so she could send money home, so they wouldn't go hungry. A sharp knock on the kitchen door startled her. She turned to see Chike, the driver, standing there with his arms crossed. He was one of the few people in the house who treated her like a human being. "Madam say make you come parlor," he said, his voice laced with sympathy. Her heart pounded. Had she done something wrong again? She wiped her hands on her faded dress and followed Chike to the living room. Madame Ephema was seated on the couch, her bejeweled fingers tapping impatiently on the armrest. An unfamiliar man sat across from her, dressed in a fine suit. He had an air of importance about him, his expression unreadable. Chinaza kept her head down, her mind racing. Who was he? Why had she been called? Chinaza, Madame Ephema's voice cut through the silence. "This is Chief Odogwu. He has a job for you." "A job?" Her head shot up in surprise. She had never heard Madame Ephema speak of sending her elsewhere before. She glanced at the man, who studied her with keen interest. "Come closer," he said, his deep voice calm but firm. Chinaza hesitated, then took a step forward. Chief Odogwu's gaze traveled over her, as if assessing her worth. "I need a house girl," he said. "My mother is old and sick, and I need someone to care for her. Madame Ephema says you're hardworking. Do you want the job?" Her heart pounded. Leave this house. A chance to escape Madame Ephema's torment. But she had also heard stories of housemaids who left one bad situation only to enter a worse one. She turned to Madame Ephema, expecting her to refuse on her behalf. After all, she always said good maids were hard to find. But instead, the woman waved a dismissive hand. "Say yes, girl. You should be grateful." Chinaza swallowed. She wanted to ask questions, but she knew better than to speak too much. "I'll go," she said quietly. Chief Odogwu nodded. "Good. We leave first thing in the morning." As he stood to leave, Chinaza felt a mix of fear and hope twisting in her stomach. She didn't know what awaited her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like her life was about to change. Chinaza barely slept that night. She lay on the thin mattress in the small room she had called home for the past 2 years, staring at the ceiling. Was this really happening? Was she finally leaving this house? Her mind swirled with questions. Would Chief Odogwu treat her better than Madame Ephema? What kind of person was his mother? Would she ever see Chike again, the only person in this house who had shown her kindness? At dawn, she packed the few belongings she had into a small nylon bag. A faded wrapper, 2 dresses, and a pair of worn-out slippers. That was all she owned. Chike knocked on her door just as she tied the bag shut. "Na time," he said simply. His voice was calm, but she could tell he was sad. She followed him outside, where a black SUV was parked in front of the house. Chief Odogwu stood beside it, speaking on the phone. He barely acknowledged her as Chike helped load her bag into the car. "Take care, Chinaza," Chike said, his voice low. She wanted to say something, to thank him for the times he had saved her from punishment, for the stolen moments of kindness. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded. Chief Odogwu ended his call and gestured for her to get in. She slid into the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As the car pulled away, she turned to see Madame Ephema watching from the veranda, arms folded. No goodbye, no last words. Just like that, her life in that house was over. The ride was long and silent. The city slowly faded into a quieter, more rural area. Chinaza had no idea where they were going. Chief Odogwu never spoke, his focus on the road. After what felt like hours, they pulled up in front of a large, old house surrounded by tall trees. It was nothing like Madame Ephema's modern mansion. The paint was peeling, and the gate creaked as a guard pushed it open. "This is my mother's house," Chief Odogwu said as he stepped out. Chinaza followed, her heart racing. A woman was already waiting at the entrance. She was tall and thin, with sharp features and piercing eyes. Something about her made Chinaza uneasy. "This is Aunty Ngozi," Chief Odogwu introduced. "She runs the house. You will report to her." Chinaza lowered her gaze. "Good evening, Ma." Aunty Ngozi didn't return the greeting. Instead, she looked her up and down with clear disapproval. "This is the girl?" she asked, turning to Chief Odogwu. "She will do," he replied before walking past them and disappearing into the house. Aunty Ngozi narrowed her eyes at Chinaza. "Listen carefully," she said coldly. "This is not a place for laziness. You are here to work, not to complain. Do your job well, and you won't have any problems." Chinaza nodded quickly. She had learned long ago that arguing was useless. "Come," Aunty Ngozi said, turning sharply. Chinaza followed her inside, stepping into a new world where she had no idea what awaited her. Chinaza followed Aunty Ngozi through a narrow hallway that smelled of dust and old wood. The house was nothing like Madame Ephema's. It felt older, quieter, but not in a comforting way. Something about it made her uneasy. Aunty Ngozi led her into a small, dimly lit room with a single bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a small window with torn curtains. "This is where you'll stay," Aunty Ngozi said, folding her arms. "Wake up early. Work starts before sunrise." Chinaza nodded. She had learned never to argue. Aunty Ngozi left without another word, shutting the door behind her. Chinaza sat on the bed, running her fingers over the rough fabric of the thin bedsheet. Her new life had begun. The next morning, before the first light of dawn, Aunty Ngozi banged on her door. "Wake up," she barked. Chinaza jumped up and quickly tied her wrapper. She hurried to the kitchen, where Aunty Ngozi was already cutting vegetables. An older woman sat in a chair by the window, her wrinkled hands resting on her lap. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, studied Chinaza closely. "This is Mama," Aunty Ngozi said. "Chief Odogwu's mother." Chinaza bent her knees in greeting. "Good morning, Mama." Mama didn't respond immediately. She only stared at her, then finally said, "What is your name?" "Chinaza, Ma." Mama hummed thoughtfully. "You are the one my son brought here?" "Yes, Ma." She said nothing more, only turning her gaze toward the window. Aunty Ngozi handed Chinaza a knife. "You will cook today," she said. "Show me if you are useful." Chinaza swallowed hard. Cooking was one of the few things she knew well. She set to work, preparing the ingredients with steady hands. As she worked, she felt Mama's gaze on her. The woman never spoke but observed everything. By the time breakfast was ready, Chief Odogwu appeared, dressed in a clean suit, looking far more polished than the man who had picked her up the day before. He barely glanced at Chinaza as he greeted his mother and took a seat. Mama tasted the food and nodded slightly. "She can cook," she said simply. Aunty Ngozi didn't look pleased, but she said nothing. Chinaza kept her head down, relief washing over her. At least for today, she had passed one test. As she cleared the plates after breakfast, Mama suddenly spoke again. "Come here, Chinaza." Chinaza wiped her hands and stepped forward. "Yes, Ma?" Mama studied her with narrowed eyes. "What did my son tell you about this house?" Chinaza hesitated. "Nothing, Ma." Mama hummed again, leaning back in her chair. "Good. Then you will learn on your own." Chinaza had no idea what that meant, but she had a feeling she would soon find out. Chinaza spent the rest of the morning scrubbing the floors while Aunty Ngozi supervised her every move. The woman's sharp eyes missed nothing, and she criticized every small mistake. "You call this clean?" Aunty Ngozi hissed, pointing at a corner of the sitting room. "Are you blind?" Chinaza swallowed her frustration and scrubbed harder. She had learned long ago that complaining never helped. By noon, the front door swung open, and a tall man in his early 30s walked in. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the house. He had the same strong features as Chief Odogwu, but his sharp gaze carried an air of coldness. "Ekene, you're back," Mama said from her seat by the window. "Yes, Mama," he responded, his voice deep and controlled. His eyes flickered to Chinaza for a brief second before he turned to Aunty Ngozi. "Is lunch ready?" "Yes, Oga Ekene," she said quickly, hurrying toward the kitchen. Chinaza kept her head down, focusing on her work, but she could feel Ekene's gaze on her. There was something unsettling about the way he observed her, like he was trying to figure her out. A few minutes later, Chief Odogwu arrived, talking loudly on his phone. He barely acknowledged Chinaza as he passed, but he greeted his mother before settling into one of the chairs. "Where is my food?" he demanded. "It's coming, my son," Mama said calmly. Chinaza hurried to the kitchen to help carry the food to the dining table. As she set the plates down, she heard Ekene's voice behind her. "You're new here," he said. Chinaza turned slowly and bent her knees slightly. "Yes, sir." Ekene smirked. "I see." Then he turned away without another word, leaving her feeling uneasy. During lunch, she stood quietly by the kitchen door as they ate. She listened carefully, noting how differently Ekene spoke compared to his father. While Chief Odogwu was loud and commanding, Ekene was calm but sharp, like someone who didn't waste words. "She can cook," Mama finally said, referring to Chinaza. Chief Odogwu grunted. "Good. At least she's not completely useless." Chinaza's fingers tightened around the edge of her wrapper, but she said nothing. She had expected such words. She was used to being treated like she didn't matter. After the meal, Aunty Ngozi ordered her to wash the dishes. As she stood at the sink, scrubbing the plates, she heard soft footsteps behind her. When she turned, Ekene was leaning against the counter, watching her. "You seem different," he said. Chinaza froze, not sure how to respond. "I mean, you don't look like an ordinary house girl." His eyes studied her carefully. "Where did my father find you?" She lowered her gaze. "I don't know, sir." Ekene chuckled. Interesting." He tapped the counter and walked away, leaving Chinaza more confused than before. Something about this house was strange, and she could feel it deep in her bones. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had work to do, and if there was one thing she had learned in life, it was that the only way to survive was to keep her head down and follow orders. At least, for now. As the days passed, Chinaza grew accustomed to the strict routine of the Odogwu household. She woke before dawn, cleaned every inch of the massive house, cooked meals under Aunty Ngozi's harsh supervision, and endured sharp words from Chief Odogwu whenever he was displeased. But it was Ekene who unsettled her the most. He watched her too closely, always observing her with a curious expression. He never spoke much, but when he did, his words carried weight. One evening, after everyone had eaten, Chinaza was washing the plates in the kitchen when Ekene entered. He leaned against the counter, his eyes never leaving her hands as they worked over the dishes. "You've been here for a while now," he said. "How do you find the house?" Chinaza hesitated before answering. "It is fine, sir." Ekene chuckled. "You don't talk much, do you?" She kept her gaze on the soapy water. "I only speak when necessary." "I see." He paused. "Where are your parents?" She stiffened. That was a question she did not want to answer. "They are no longer here," she said quietly. Ekene nodded slowly, as if studying her reaction. "Did my father buy you?" Chinaza's heart pounded, but she kept her face blank. "I don't know, sir." He exhaled sharply. "You're different. I can tell." Before she could respond, Aunty Ngozi's voice rang through the hallway. "Chinaza, have you finished washing those plates?" Chinaza quickly rinsed the last dish and placed it on the rack. "Yes, Ma." Ekene smirked. "Go on then. Don't keep her waiting." She hurried out of the kitchen, her heart still racing. Later that night, as she lay on the thin mattress in the small room she had been given, she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was about to change. Ekene's curiosity about her wasn't normal. And Chief Odogwu's household, though grand, was hiding something. But what? For now, she had no choice but to wait and see. She only hoped that whatever was coming would not destroy her. The next morning, Chinaza was up before the sun, sweeping the front yard when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found Ekene standing there, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers. He had an unreadable expression on his face. "I need you to do something for me," he said. Chinaza's hands tightened around the broom. "Sir." Ekene glanced toward the main house before lowering his voice. "Meet me at the back gate this evening. Don't let anyone see you." Her stomach tightened with uncertainty. "Why, sir?" A small smirk appeared on his lips. "Just come. You'll see." And with that, he walked away, leaving her with 1,000 questions. Throughout the day, Chinaza struggled to focus on her chores. What did Ekene want from her? Did he know something about her past? Was she in trouble? Aunty Ngozi scolded her twice for being distracted, but she couldn't help it. When evening came, she hesitated by the back gate, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped outside. Ekene was already waiting. He leaned against a sleek black car, his arms crossed. "You're brave," he said. "Most girls wouldn't have come." Chinaza swallowed. "What do you want from me?" His eyes searched hers, as if deciding how much to say. "I want to know who you really are." Her breath caught in her throat. "I already told you. Don't lie to me." His voice was quiet but firm. "You don't act like a house girl. You don't talk like one. My father has had many servants, but you're different." She looked away, panic rising in her chest. "I don't know what you mean." Ekene sighed. "Fine. Keep your secrets. But I'll find out the truth sooner or later." He opened the car door and took out a small wrapped package. "Here," he said, handing it to her. Chinaza hesitated before accepting it. The weight of the package made her heart pound. "What is this?" "A gift," he said simply. "Don't open it here. Take it to your room." Before she could ask any more questions, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing there, confused and shaken. That night, as she unwrapped the package, her hands trembled. Inside was a small envelope with money and something else. A faded photograph. Chinaza gasped, her entire body going cold. The image was old, but she recognized the face immediately. It was a picture of her mother. Chinaza barely got any sleep that night. The strange way Ekene had looked at her, his cryptic words, it all lingered in her mind like an unanswered question. Something about him made her uneasy, but she couldn't afford to let her curiosity get the best of her. In this house, keeping her head down was her only option. By dawn, she was up before anyone else, sweeping the compound. The early morning air was cool, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the silence. But the peace didn't last long. "Chinaza, have you watered the plants?" Aunty Ngozi's voice rang out from inside the house. Chinaza dropped the broom and hurried to the backyard, grabbing the watering can. Just as she started pouring water on the flowers, she heard footsteps behind her. "Why do you let them treat you like this?" She turned sharply. Ekene stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. I don't have a choice," she said carefully. He tilted his head slightly. "Everyone has a choice." Chinaza didn't respond. What choice did she have? She had nowhere else to go. Before she could say anything else, Chief Odogwu's voice boomed from the front of the house. "Ekene, come and join me for breakfast." Ekene sighed and gave her one last look before walking away. Chinaza exhaled, relieved to be left alone, but something about his words stayed with her. As she continued her chores, she tried to push the thoughts away. She had more important things to worry about, like making sure Aunty Ngozi didn't find fault in her work. But deep down, a small part of her wondered, was Ekene right? Did she have a choice after all? The day went by in a blur of endless chores. Chinaza barely had a moment to rest, running from one errand to the next under Aunty Ngozi's sharp supervision. By evening, her feet ached, and her hands were raw from scrubbing. As she finished cleaning the dining table after dinner, she overheard a conversation between Chief Odogwu and his wife in the sitting room. "The boy is too soft," Chief Odogwu muttered. "He is not like me. He is different, but that does not mean he is weak," Mama said calmly. "Ekene has his own mind." Chief Odogwu scoffed. "A man must be firm. He spends too much time observing things, asking questions. It is not always good to question too much." Chinaza's ears perked up. Was Chief Odogwu talking about Ekene? Something about the way he spoke made it sound like Ekene's curiosity was a problem. She quickly finished wiping the table and carried the cloth to the kitchen, trying to push their conversation from her mind. It was not her business. She had enough problems of her own. Later that night, as she lay on her small mattress in the corner of the kitchen, she thought about Ekene's words again. "Why do you let them treat you like this?" The question refused to leave her mind. For so long, she had accepted that this was her life. But now, a tiny spark of something dangerous stirred inside her. Hope. She shook her head and turned over, forcing herself to sleep. Hope was useless. Hope could get her into trouble. The next morning, Chinaza woke up to Aunty Ngozi's sharp voice calling her name. She dragged herself off the thin mattress, her body aching from the previous day's work. "Hurry up. Do you think this house runs itself?" Aunty Ngozi snapped. Chinaza quickly washed her face and got to work. As she swept the front porch, she saw Ekene stepping out of the house, dressed in a crisp shirt and trousers. He paused when he saw her, his sharp eyes scanning her face. "You don't look like you slept well," he observed. Chinaza kept her gaze down. "I'm fine, sir." He hesitated, then walked past her, heading towards his car. But just as he opened the door, he turned back. "You should learn to speak up for yourself." Chinaza said nothing. What was the point? Speaking up never changed anything. Later in the day, while she was washing clothes in the backyard, she heard hushed voices coming from the living room. Curious, she moved closer to the window and peered inside. Chief Odogwu was sitting with a man she had never seen before. He was short and round, with a thick mustache and a calculating look in his eyes. "The deal is set," the man said. "But your son is asking too many questions." Chief Odogwu's face darkened. "Leave Ekene to me. Just make sure the money is ready." Chinaza's heart pounded. What deal were they talking about? And why did it sound so secretive? Before she could think further, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around and found Ekene standing there, watching her with narrowed eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked. I was just," she stammered, searching for an excuse. Ekene stepped closer. "You were listening, weren't you?" Chinaza swallowed hard. If he reported her, she could be in serious trouble. But the look in his eyes wasn't anger, it was curiosity. "Be careful," he said quietly. "There are things happening in this house that you don't understand." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her more confused than ever. Hello family, kindly tell us where you are watching from and the time your watch says right now in the comment section. We would love